Just before getting to this video, the audio was recorded at the same time as the Series 1 retrospective, and it originally was meant to be one long video. And the reason I split it up is basically due to time, but also I wasn't quite happy with it, but some people seem to like it, so I'm just going to go ahead with the audio and that as is. So yeah, let me know if I should continue on or whether I should go back and redo the Series 1 and 2 retrospective. Series 2 kicks off to an absolute banger. Yeah, the Series 2 opener, Kidnapped, is exactly what it says on the tin. So, since the Draculas and now the Van Helsings know about each other, they know that they're slayers, they know that they're vampires, it all kind of kicks off. And basically, Eric Van Helsing manages to capture Vlad and Ingrid, and Dracula manages to capture Jonathan. This is where the Dracula sacrificing himself for his kicks comes up, in that he is willing to be taken in exchange for them. But suffice it to say, in the end it all comes up nil on both ends. For the next 3 episodes we get a little mini story arc about Dracula's younger brother Ivan coming to visit because it's around about time for his son Boris to go through the transformation, in which they require the Dracula family mirror for, which Count Dracula keeps. I just think of this as a bit of an awkward thing because, you know, it's just one mirror and that for the entire family. It's never really presumed otherwise, so yeah, that means that basically any Dracula who turns 16 in order to, you know, properly get their transformation has to travel to wherever this mirror is. And this whole mirror thing would be slightly reimagined in the further series.
Open the vortex!
But regardless, to get onto this little mini arc, the first episode reveals that Ivan has actually gone cold turkey. He has decided to actually stop drinking any blood whatsoever and go completely vegetarian. After, in his words, going completely out of control and got talking to a pack of wolves who showed him the way of the light, which this absolutely horrifies Dracula. Unfortunately, this turn does not last very long, as when Eric Van Helsing receives a cut and Ivan smells it, he immediately turns back into basically the blood-sucking thirsty vampire that he was beforehand. This is soul-crushing for Vlad because he thought that there would be a way out after that maybe having the transformation wouldn't turn him into a blood-sucking vampire, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. Boris, his older cousin, is also really worried about having the changing, turning into a vampire. Boris, for his first 2 episodes, is presented as an absolute wimp and coward, someone who definitely does not want to become a fully fledged vampire. Though it's more of him basically being a coward more than anything else, rather than not particularly wanting to bite people as much and become, you know, an evil vampire like Vlad does. As Vlad very much just wants to live with breathers, Boris is less more concerned about that and just more concerned about what he may become after the transformation. In episode 2, after some false evidence placed by Eric Van Helsing, the two of them find out that if they smash the vampire blood mirror, then their whole family will be transformed into breathers. However, there is a catch that Van Helsing deliberately left out of this, in that if a vampire blood mirror is smashed, yes, it will turn them all back into breathers or human, but also the fact that the Count is over 600 years old and would just crumble to dust. They are, however, stopped in time before this is happening, also changing the circumstances on what happened. So after the series finale of Series 1, Chloe decides that she's done with this. She is no longer hanging out with Vlad and suggests that Robin does the same because, rightfully so, her family were nearly killed at that Dracula ball. Though she knows telling her family the truth of what actually happened there would just be an absolute laughingstock. Which, unfortunately for this series, means that she doesn't really have much to do throughout this series. Anyway, getting on to the third of this mini-arc trilogy at the start of the series, the third episode actually for the first time shows a transformation. Well, the transformation itself happens off-screen. Basically, Boris becomes a fully fledged vampire and becomes a completely different person. He is confident, he is cocky, and he is definitely up for blood. The power goes to his head and he becomes a little bit insane. He manages to steal power from the blood mirror, which in a result is slowly aging and killing his father and uncle. Vlad manages to trick him to giving the power back, and as a result he is basically locked up and sent to, I don't know, whatever the equivalent of vampire prison is off screen. And he takes one great joy in telling Vlad that there's no way out of the transformation and he will become a blood-sucking vampire. The rest of the series is basically back to the basic old situation that we had in Series 1, in the Problem of the Week. They do mix up a few things though, because now Jonathan knows about them being vampires. They add in Jonathan's mother, who Eric and him split up long ago because of his obsession with vampires. Throughout the series, the two of them have to hide the fact that they're still slaying because they promised to not slay anymore so that they could all become a family again. There's also an episode where Magda comes back and reveals that she's pregnant and has another baby. With it presumably being Dracula's, Dracula decides that if Vlad doesn't want the title, then fine, his newborn son can have it. Though it is revealed at the end of the episode that this is not Dracula's child, it's actually Patrick's. And while the baby itself isn't really important that much here, he will become a semi-main character in later series. I think Body Swap is an interesting episode this series, mainly in the fact that it does the body swap thing of basically having Dracula possess Van Helsing, although it's basically a battle between the two of them to try and fight in control of his body. It is pretty funny to see Terrence Manard try his best Count Dracula impression. It is really entertaining throughout, and it's probably one of the highlights of this series. And yeah, Dracula just intends to just keep this body indefinite at one point because, well, if he's possessing Eric Van Helsing, he has the advantage of he can go out in the sunlight and basically commit any evil deed and that he wants at any time. Towards the end of the series though, the series does start to change and becomes noticeably darker, and we get sort of hints on what the series would then later become. So this series, Ingrid gets a breather boyfriend. It's not really much point in knowing his name because basically his character is Ingrid's boyfriend. But anyway, in episode 10 of series 2, Swix 16, it is finally time for Ingrid to get her vampire powers, and she is absolutely over the moon about it, until her reflection shows that when she does get the powers, she will devour her boyfriend. Something she refuses to do. Her mirror image says that all breathers' blood must be drank, and her reflection proceeds to come out of the mirror and basically take Ingrid's body. Vlad frees Ingrid from the chamber just in time, but the reflection can basically travel like a ghost anywhere where Ingrid does, which is where they discover that basically the way to not become a massive bloodsucker and become, evil, or in Ingrid's case, eviler, is to basically run away from your reflection for all eternity. Also, the way this works is a little bit confusing because Ingrid now cannot go out in sunlight, so clearly the vampirisms have taken effect because she now can no longer just go out in sunlight, but she doesn't have the desire to bite people. I don't know. Her reflection is basically shown as her evil side, and to receive her real full power she has to basically merge with it. In the end she does merge with it and her dark side becomes part of her. Although, how different this makes Ingrid to before kinda just depends on the episode. But the main thing to come off with this is that Ingrid now has her full powers. She is now basically a fully fledged vampire. And what happens in the next episode is also when the series gets darker. So, Ingrid decides to meet her boyfriend at the cinema, on a date, and during the date she actually admits to him that she's a vampire. He doesn't really believe and takes the piss, and this annoys Ingrid enough that she bites him.
Where are you going?
As far away from you as I can get!
Aye, aye. Looks like trouble.
They fight, then they kiss. What's that about?
Women, and it is shown on screen. Yep, this is a CBBC show. And for those in the US wondering what that stands for, it stands for Children's BBC. I also should mention that blood is basically just shown casually in that throughout the series as well. They really pushed sometimes in this show what they could get away with on the CBBC channel. And I remember watching this episode at 9 years old and actually being shocked that they actually went there. This is also all in front of view of Jonathan, who sneaks in wearing a lady's outfit. And I do love the fact that he tried wearing various beards and stuff, but it was the woman's outfit that actually got him able to sneak into a presumably 15 or 18 rated film. But if you think that's the end of Ingrid's boyfriend, not quite, because he does actually just turn into a vampire and, yeah, just lives at the castle now. We don't see or ever hear of his boyfriend's parents, so we don't know what her boyfriend's parents, did or what happened to them or anything. For all we know, he just decided to abandon them at some point and just cut off all contact. Regardless, let's talk about the last 2 episodes of Series 2, which are kind of a 2-parter and kind of just 2 episodes that are just heavily linked to each other. So, it turns out in this episode that Boris, remember him, off-screen has basically been telling the Vampire High Council that Dracula and his kids are basically being mixing with breathers, which is a big no-no in vampire culture. Dracula is basically put on trial by the Grand High Vampire, and if he is found guilty, then he will be dusted at noon, or death by sunlight. However, during these events, someone dusks, and when I say dusks, I mean basically staked or murdered the Grand High Vampire, and basically his right-hand man throughout has to basically work out who is the one that did it. However, it turns out that the Grand High Vampire's right man was actually dusted off screen by Boris. Boris was the one who actually dusted, or shall we just say killed, or ultra killed, or whatever it is, the Grand High Vampire, in basically an attempt to basically take his crown and receive ultimate power. This, though, kind of goes tits up for him, because as soon as he tries putting on the crown, he crumbles to dust himself, as basically anyone unworthy and that of the power will basically just turn to dust. Also in this episode, Eric Van Helsing actually has the chance to just flat out stake and kill Count Dracula, but after something he whispers into his ear, he decides not to. It's revealed that Eric Van Helsing's wife actually got kidnapped by Count Dracula off screen and has been a prisoner in the dungeon for several episodes now. He is told by Count Dracula in this whisper that if he just leaves quietly, then no harm would come to her. Though they do prepare to storm the castle the following night and basically kill all the Draculas and get Jonathan's mother back. So here it is, the finale of Series 2, which is an episode shorter than Series 1, but it's the same length as every other series, like 13 episodes. So this follows on basically pretty much immediately after the events of episode 12. The Draculas and the Vampire High Council need to find a new Grand High Vampire, along to lead them. This is where we hear about the Chosen One, a vampire with exceptional powers who will lead vampires out of the Dark Ages and into a new dawn. We did get hints about this earlier on in the series. For example, earlier on in the series, there's a whole episode about Vlad going to the Dream World, which is something where all vampires go to, and it's basically Nightmare on Elm Street rules that if you die in the Dream World, you die in real life. This is where we first hear about the Chosen One, and Vlad is told that he is the chosen one, but only if he basically destroys this thing in his mind that takes the shape of his father, but he decides to not do that and kill himself as a result. Obviously, he doesn't die. But in this final episode, the ghost of the Granghai vampire keeps telling Vlad that he is the chosen one and he must put on the crown before the end of the night, otherwise, basically, his family will all die because of this. He's also told that he would have to sacrifice the life that he loves for the ones that he loves. And my god, this episode is very much an action-packed one. There is a lot happening in this episode. For example, we get this one-off Slayer character who basically keeps talking into his dictaphone, basically narrating everything he does for his own memoirs book. And while he is a one-off character, he is very entertaining and always memorable because of the basically one quips he does throughout the episode. Also in this episode, Eric Van Helsing finally gets to kill a vampire. Yeah, in this episode, he finally does it. He kills a vampire. Yes, it's just some random no-name vampire, but still, this is a moment in the series. Unfortunately though, this would pretty much end up being Eric's only vampire kill, at least on screen, so yeah. However, at the end of the episode, everything basically comes to a head. Count Dracula is basically stuck in a UV cage, that's an ultraviolet cage, that basically, if he tries to get out of it, the beam of the UV cage will basically turn him into dust. Ingrid's boyfriend has been killed, which, when you think about it, he was 16, so he was technically still a child, so yeah, even though he's turned to dust, that is still technically a kill. And it's also a clever way of doing it as well, of killing off your characters, because that is usually a big no-no for CBBC shows, but again, this one did manage to get away with it because it basically turned the characters into dust. But let me assure you, once they were turned to dust, they were done. They were pretty much dead done. So now with Slayers moving on his family, about to kill them, Vlad now has to basically put on the crown to make his ultimate sacrifice. He did try putting on the crown earlier in the episode, and while it didn't dust him, the room did start to shake around, suggesting that it wasn't the right time, which it wasn't. But now with his family in peril, and it being the right time, he puts on the crown and basically hovers into the air, gets a deep voice, tells all the vampires to go, and erases the memory of not only the Slayers, but also all of the Branners as well, including Robin, to basically forget about him and forget about vampires, that they don't exist. This also includes Renfield as well, but that would later be retconned. And yeah, as a sacrifice, this is a really big one, and basically the reason he does it, particularly even does it to Robin, is basically because, well, they wouldn't be safe otherwise. If they knew about vampires, then basically the entire time they would be in danger from them. So basically he keeps them in ignorance and that, and knows that particularly if Robin still knew, then he would try and find him and most likely get himself killed. At least that's what I read into it, because again, while Robin is mentioned in later series, Vlad never really goes into the fact that he erased his memory and that. He never really brings it up that much or mentions it. But yeah, unfortunately, Vlad had to basically lose his basically one and only real, human friend and that he had and that left. And also this life that he led, going to school and basically living as close as possible to a normal life. Vlad then drops to the floor after doing all this, completely motionless. Ingrid moves over to him, and Dracula asks, is he dead or not? And this is where the twist comes round, well, sort of, that Ingrid doesn't care and decides, now and time and finally, it is her time to take the Dracula throne, and she will make the streets of Stokely run with blood. We get a slight movement of Vlad moving his head slightly, showing that yes, he is indeed still alive, and then credits.
From now on, you will call me Countess Dracula. Watch me as I avenge Will's death and make the streets of Stokely run red with blood.
Yep, that's it. That's how the series ends. That's how Series 2 ends, and for a cliffhanger for an end of a series, yeah, this was a pretty big one. This final episode packed in so much into one, and basically changed everything going forward from this point onwards. Unfortunately, it would be a 4-year gap between series, yeah. This episode, just for example, was broadcast on the 8th of February 2008, and it wasn't until the 31st of October 2011, just shy of 4 years later, that Series 3 would air. So yeah, and between those times, there was no confirmation at all that it would indeed ever come back. It just kind of remained in this hiatus state. So yeah, I'm glad it didn't end here, because for years it was so frustrating that this is how it ended, because basically it didn't really end on a satisfying note. It ended on a dark, dramatic note, but yeah, it just kind of ended on too many really open ends for things. But how they would conclude that, I think I'll save that for another video, because this video has gone on way too long as it is. So to overall give my thoughts on Series 1 and 2 of Young Dracula, I do really like it. The sitcom sort of vibes and that to this one does make it very distinct and that from the later series. It does feel more sort of child friendly and more, you know, of a typical CBBC type show this era compared to the next era, which was more of a teetering on adult drama type series at times. Whereas this series, doing that though, it still wasn't afraid to push the barrier and go a bit darker. It was also really entertaining throughout, basically. I don't think there was really any bad performances and that throughout. Basically, everyone was giving their A game and being entertaining as well. And you can see, you know, a sort of slow progression and that into that, where, you know, the dark tone doesn't just come out of nowhere, it slowly builds up throughout the series, and it is a series I'd absolutely recommend to anyone. I know some people who watch this series probably wished that they continued this more sitcom type vibe with them going to school and that for a bit longer. To be honest, I'm glad they only did it for the first 2 series, and even then they kind of dropped it a bit for several episodes during the second series, because to be honest, if they continued the way that they did during Series 1, where it was just problem or thing of the week and that for each episode, I think it would have gotten dull and that a bit quickly. I'm glad that in the second series they focus a lot more on, for example, serialization and getting things into continuity. For example, the whole stuff with Boris returning and that at the end of the series, and also with him you got the setup of the blood mirror and that earlier on and that, so we basically know the type of thing that will happen later on with Ingrid later in the series and how they try and get around it. As for leaving the series on basically an undetermined hiatus, yeah, I don't know. The fact that, you know, it did eventually come back made me feel happy and subsided by it, but the way that they did bring it back, basically there's a massive gap period of basically nearly four years where basically we don't really know what happened and that during that period. So yeah, but the fact that it didn't end here, because it was a risky move and that, but I think they did push things to the absolute nth degree with this one. So yeah, anyway, thank you for watching this video. It's gone on far too long. When will part 2 come out? I don't know. Why wasn't I doing this for Halloween? Because I had other stuff, but this is a video I've been meaning to do for ages. But anyway, there we go, people, there we go.